Hello, my name is Sam, and today I am going to be introducing you to a bold new frontier in the exciting world of database querying, and attempting not to read off my slides the entire time. Namely, I'm going to show you GraphQL, Apollo, and a little bit of something called GraphCool. So, begin at the beginning. What is GraphQL? As you might be able to guess from the last two letters, GraphQL is a query language. It was invented by Facebook and used there initially starting in 2012. But in 2015, it was released publicly and open sourced. Facebook invented it to solve some problems that they were having, particularly with their mobile app inherent to the REST API. Now, I know what you're thinking. The REST API, we love that. Yes, we do, but it does present some problems. For example, since one specific entity is conceptually represented by one specific URL, a RESTful API requires a lot of endpoints for different HTTP requests to the backend. So let's say we have a database of your friends, and you want to find your friend's favorite movie, friend A's favorite movie. It's simple, right? Sure. But if you want to find the favorite movies of all the friend A's friends who live in Brooklyn, it becomes a lot more complicated. Namely, you're going to be making a lot more requests to the database. You could split entry points, but then there's this proliferation of entry points relating to logic duplication and implementation duplication. It is not very dry. Another issue is that the JSON sent via the RESTful API is really big. If you just want your friend's name, you will get it. But you will also get his age, his location, his life story, everything else that's associated with his instance in the database. This is costly for the provider of the API and makes it difficult for an app developer to get what they need to show the user. All of this gets even more complicated if you have different kinds of clients, like mobile, tablet. You'd be creating custom endpoints. It's a big pain in the butt. So all these problems have something in common, and it's a question that GraphQL seeks to answer. When a client makes a request to a database, how do we avoid sending them too much or too little info? GraphQL. It'll turn your queries looking like this to looking like this. Yeah? So, what are the key features of GraphQL? For one thing, the queries are shaped the same way as the data that's returned. You can actually see this in the image on my title slide that I pulled from the GraphQL website. That thing in the middle is the query, and the thing on the right is the response. As you can see, they look almost exactly the same. And that carries through to complex requests as well as simple ones like this. Hold on, where was I? Yes. Another thing, it can be used to resolve data from any backend. In addition to JavaScript, it has implementations in Python, in Ruby, in PHP, in Scala. You don't need to be using JavaScript. You don't even need to be using like SQL or Postgres. You can use Mongo. It's broadly applicable. But the good stuff comes next. It's driven by requirements of exactly what's happening on the front end. This means that a query returns only what a client asks for, nothing more. It takes care of the too much information problem that I mentioned earlier. Requests aren't being responded to with these huge JSON files, which means you avoid lots of negative externalities like slowing down bandwidth on mobile apps. GraphQL also interacts with a single endpoint, which allows you to nest requests for efficiency. You get lots of data back, but still only make one request. This takes care of the too little data problem, and it means that the client isn't going to be making 15 HTTP requests to get one piece of complete data. So, I know what you're thinking. How does it work? We will begin at the front end. I'm on the back end now. Got too excited. OK, front end with queries. GraphQL uses a type system that you define for your data. So there's more work at the beginning of a project, but A, it's a little like Redux, where you do a little extra work at the beginning and save a lot of pain at the end. And B, there's a lot of really nifty libraries and tools that make the building of this type system a lot easier. And I'm going to go into those in a bit. For now, though, GraphQL service is created by defining types and fields on those types, and then providing functions for each field on type. Hold on. Yeah, here we go. Once a GraphQL service is running, it can be sent it can be sent GraphQL queries to validate and execute. This means those two words that I used. A received query is first checked to ensure that it refers only to types and fields in the type system that we set up. That's the validation. Then, once it passes that test, it becomes executed by a resolver, which I'll get to in a second. Here you can see an example of a GraphQL function as well, or a GraphQL query, that is, as well as the type, the field, and the object returned. The data, when it arrives, comes in scalar types or scalar types. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Those are strings, floats, integers, booleans, sort of like the tiny nuggets of irreducible data. It's important to understand that each field is like an object, too. You can kind of see that in the way that it's set up with the curly braces. This means that GraphQL queries can traverse related objects. So you can get lots of related data in one request. We'll go more into this later. More GraphQL field facts. You can pass arguments into them. This makes GraphQL a complete replacement for making multiple API requests. So like when you make an API request, again, the whole point of GraphQL is to only get data that you absolutely need. So kind of all the way down, you can be defining and filtering the data you get back with argument types. There's a bunch more really cool stuff on the front end of the GraphQL, but I'm going to skip it because it's late and would take forever to go over. So I just want to get to mutations, which is the last kind of a major part of any query language. Mutations is a catch-all term for post, put, and delete requests in a REST API, anything that alters the data in the database. The example shown here uses a few aspects of GraphQL on the front end that we didn't go over, like variables, like variables. But you can see, the main point I bring this up is so you can see that a mutation is almost as simple as a query. You name your mutation, include a payload, and presto, you have a mutation that has been sent to the backend. So this is a very, very simplified picture of the backend. But before we get into it, the first thing to remember is that it's a type system. It's a little more gnarly than the front end because it deals with these things called schemas and resolvers. To radically oversimplify things, as I'm doing on this picture, a schema is the structure that a query gets sent to, and a resolver is the function that finds the correct data for the parameters of your query. The most basic elements of a GraphQL schema type are object types and fields. Is that on my next thing? Yes. As touched on earlier, these represent an object that you can fetch from your service and what fields that object has or requires. You can see here, so character is the GraphQL object type. Name and appears in are fields that appear on this object type and will return scalar value. String, exclamation point. The string is is a build in the scalar type, and the exclamation point means the field is required. And then right below appears in, you can also see that this field is required, and it's going to return an array. Oh, yeah. OK. Before I get into how does it work in setting up a schema, I'll just say that query and mutation types, most query types in your schema are going to be normal object types and fields, but there are two special ones, query and mutation types. They're identical to type objects, except they define entry points to your queries, all your queries and mutations. But I don't want to spend too much time on it because clients like Apollo Client and tools like GraphCool take care of some of this for you, and we should really get into them. But first, I just want to show you what setting up a GraphQL is like without a client. So this is the beginning of setting up a schema. You import or you npm install GraphQL, and that gives you this function called build schema. And then in build schema, you can see a query type and a schema type. Then you do your resolvers. For example, this resolver down here defines the query for foo, returns the string bar. And then after that, you can start building your query. You can name it my first query and make it foo. And then you can wrap the whole thing in GraphQL, give it the parameters for your schema, your query, your resolvers. That is how I felt building even that very, very small example of GraphQL. But there's some good news. React Apollo is an Apollo client is it's something that manages server-side GraphQL data in your React app, so you don't have to. This is an example of what React Apollo looks like. Again, it's hard to really get a sense of how much easier this makes things, but what you can see here is, oh, hold on, let me just go to my notes. You can see here, we're wrapping this component called channels list. It receives a prop called data defined by Apollo client, and that'll contain channels fetched from the server or error when there's an error. It also gives us a loading property, which is true when the Apollo client is still waiting for data to be fetched, so it doesn't throw up a weird red text error that is incomprehensible to the user. The Apollo client is also visible here on the render method. We wrap the top-level app with Apollo provider, which puts an instance of the client on the UI. I'm not going to lie. When I came up with this talk, I thought I was going to be talking more about Apollo, but I'm not, because I really, really fell in love with something I didn't know about until I started researching this talk, called GraphCool. So that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time on. This is GraphCool. If you want to make setting up server-side GraphQL even easier than you do with Apollo client, you can use a service called GraphCool. This is not a perfect analogy, but I like to think of GraphCool as kind of the postico to GraphQL's Postgres. In as much as it's a GUI that helps you visualize aspects of your GraphQL setup, and particularly when you're feeling out how the GraphQL system works, it's super intuitive and helps you kind of internalize the logic behind GraphQL. This is what it looks like when you create a new project in GraphCool. You've got your schema and your data. I don't know if you can see these on the left side. And from the schema, you can view your two types that are created automatically by GraphCool, and the specifications of the fields in those types on the right. If you want to add a type, you just click Add Type in the, here it is, in the upper right-hand corner. Yeah, and once you create a new type, you can add or edit its fields. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Once you create a new type, you can add or edit its fields. This is what it looks like when you want to add a field. Again, very clean, very intuitive, completely idiot-proof, which is a good thing if you're me. Now, once you create the new type, you can add data by clicking on the Data tab. You can click, you add data by clicking on the Data tab, and your next step is to hook your components up. Oh, you can just see here that a new type has been created in the schema, even though you made it with the GUI, instead of actually typing out the language. This is what I was supposed to show when I was talking about data. Once you create a new data type, you can add data by clicking on the Data tab. Again, this sort of handles what would otherwise be covered by your resolvers. So instead of, instead of working with two different looking functions in a JavaScript file, it's very easy to see how they're related. Your next step is to hook your components up into the backend that you set up with GraphCool. To do this, all you need is to import the Create Network Interface column from Apollo Client, because GraphCool does work directly with Apollo Client, and modify your Apollo Client to hit the API endpoints link that you can get from the endpoints section of GraphCool. Here on the top, you can see the API endpoints section, and on the bottom, you can see this client that we've created and how the Create Network Interface easily accesses your GraphCool data. Now we have a working app. I got to talk a little more about GraphCool. It's so cool. It's like I said, so easy to create new types, to define the relations between those types. It's an awesome, awesome technology, and I'm really excited to use it in the future. I hope you guys are too. That's the end of my talk.